Welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast. Here is Munir Al-Azouzi from easymedicaldevice.com. And today we will go to the USA and we will go to learn more about the promotional compliance for medical devices. And for that, I invited Darshan Kulkarni, who is the principal attorney at the Kulkarni Law Firm. And he will be our teacher today and to tell us how to do that in the USA. Because I'm not used for all these things. So it's great to have somebody that will teach me and also teach the audience about that. So Darshan, hi, welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast.
Thank you for having me, Munir. I appreciate it. And it's funny to think of inviting people to the USA. I don't have a passport office or anything, so this should be easy. Okay. I hear immigration's become harder, so
that's
true. It's a little bit easier. It's good to have you guys, and I'm excited to talk about some of the fun stuff that's going on in medical devices. And there'll be a future that maybe we talk a little bit about things like pre-certification and stuff, which is a new concept that's come up. But today we have something different and exciting planned. And we'll probably end up speaking a little bit about advertising and promotion. How do you actually talk about medical devices in a way that you can sell it, which is different in the US compared to many other countries, because you guys in the rest of the world, for the most part, don't have direct-to-consumer advertising.
Yeah. So it's something that I think would be really helpful for people that are planning maybe to sell their products in the US and to really understand what are the rules to apply and to not make any mistake. We'll also talk, I think, at one point about what are the penalties, maybe, if people are doing that. So let's do that. But before, Darshan, so let me ask you first to introduce yourself and to tell us exactly who you are for the audience, and then we can go forward with all the other questions.
Sounds good. So my name is Darshan Kulkarni. I am principal attorney at the Kulkarni Law Firm, which is based out of Philadelphia, which is, for those of you who don't know, about an hour outside New York. And that always helps ground people. In terms of my background, I have a doctorate in pharmacy, a doctorate in law, a master's in quality assurance and regulatory affairs, a fellowship and a clerkship. In terms of my work experience, I was formerly VP of Regulatory Strategy and Policy for a global consulting company, and I am also a visiting professor at the University of the Sciences, where I teach on things like promotion of biomedical products and bioethics, and I've taught on regulatory documents. I speak all over the world on these types of topics, whether we're talking about medical device promotions in general, clinical research compliance, or a wide variety of issues that go along with each of these. I've written books. So I'm currently chair of the life sciences section at the American Bar Association. So I actually end up speaking and advising and sort of organizing things to help individuals, companies comply with the myriad of requirements. And I think I mentioned I've written a couple of book chapters and stuff on this stuff as well. So we can get into each one of those, but that's a topic for another day. Today we're going to talk about something specific.
Exactly. So, but just for the audience, I will also, as you mentioned that you are also you have also written some books. So maybe to also mention that on the show notes, that if people are really interested to get that. So because as I said, it's really important to know some expert and to know also to get also some information from them. So this is one way to do it. And writing a book, I really would like to write a book one day just to have my name on it. So each time I have somebody that wrote a book, I say, okay, let's have him also. I read that and see how people are doing that. So it's great.
Well, let's talk about that at some point as well, because it's surprising people talk a lot about writing books. And I know it was on my list of things to do. And then I realized how I don't get paid for writing the book at all. You get a copy of the book typically, and you get to say that you wrote into a book. But it's never been something I've done for the money, and I've done it now for, at this point, I think about 6 years.
Okay.
But it's fun. It's you get to showcase and you get to talk about things that you do on a day-to-day basis and things that matter to you. So Definitely a conversation for another time.
Yeah, exactly. So let's do that. Let's plan that. So as we've said, so our topic of today is promotional compliance for medical devices in the USA. And Darshan, I wanted you to explain to us first, as we can say, so what is promotional compliance for people that really don't understand that?
So everyone thinks about the U.S. being. Munir, have you ever been to the U.S.?
Yes, well, mainly in California area, so not really in your area, but California area, yes.
Fair enough. So when you're in California, what was your opinion of the many ads you saw on TV
There is too
for
much
drugs and
ads.
devices?
For me, there is too much ads, to be honest. There is too much ads in comparison to Europe. But yeah, there is too much ads. There is a lot of ads that we never see in Europe. I see a lot of attorney that asking, have you ever had this disease? Have you ever had this thing? Call me, I will defend you. I say, we never had that in France or in Europe. But yeah, it's different, but a lot of ads.
Yeah, and one of the things you also see is ads for drugs and devices.
Yeah,
and that throws a lot of people off. And people are like, it's just crazy. How can you say all these things? It's so complicated. And why is the decision being made by patients? And the decision isn't being made by patients. It's a type, and there are different types of ads, for example. But for the most part, where it comes down to is there are rules that go into what you can say in an advertisement. There are rules in what you can say if you are talking as a sales rep with a device to your doctors. What are the rules if you're not a sales rep? What if you are a what's called a medical affairs person or a medical science liaison? And the rules are slightly different. And that's because of just how in the US the First Amendment comes into play. So quote unquote scientific discussion, the FDA has no jurisdiction over it. But you need to be in true scientific discussion for that to actually apply. On the other hand, if you're talking about if you're talking about advertising, the FDA may very well have a rule, have jurisdiction, have the ability to regulate it, but it depends on what type of comment you're making. So, for example, one of the more interesting things people think about is the FDA the one that governs my ads? And depending on the type of medical device that you are, the FDA may not even have jurisdiction over your potential ad. On the other hand, the FDA may sometimes, you might think that the FDA has nothing to do with what I do. So we had a situation where these doctors who were not working for a pharmaceutical company or medical device company, they were just working. And they put out ads saying, we have this latest, and I forget what machine it was, but I think it was like an MRI machine. And they were like, we have this MRI machine. It's amazing. It'll do all these great things. Theoretically speaking, that has nothing to do with the FDA, except for the fact that they were talking about an MRI machine and how it's amazing. So suddenly it went from them talking about their practice of medicine, which FDA has no control over, to them talking about a device, and they started getting warning letters from the FDA.
Okay.
So it's how you say it, what you say, who's saying it, and that's what advertising compliance is. Controlling and regulating the types of comments.
So is it the reason also why we see a lot of disclaimer saying that if you use that, you can have cancer, you can do this, you can do that, because just to say, yes, it's an amazing product, but you can have also all those side effects and this, and I told that to you, so if you have that, you cannot sue me. Is it also the reason why?
You would think so, right? You would think it would be more of a disclaimer, but that's not really the reason. So the FDA, and this applies more to drugs than to devices, but the FDA typically requires that you have what's called fair balance. So if you're going to talk about the good about something, you're required to give the equivalent bad that goes along with it. Okay. So one of the tricks that in the case of drugs people have tried to play will be talking about, oh, you know what? I have this drug that at 80 milligrams will have this amazing benefit. I'm required to have fair balance and talk about the adverse events. I'll talk about the adverse events at the 10 milligram dose. So it's the minimal adverse events with the maximal benefit. And the FDA is like, no. If you're going to talk about 80 milligrams of benefit, you need to talk about 80 milligrams of risk. So that is where that comes from. It's that fair balance requirement. Obviously, with lawyers involved, we do tend to require and help put in disclaimers, but the problem is sometimes we go too far, don't you think?
I think yes. I mean, from what I've seen, it's, as I said, it's something that maybe it's a culture difference, but it's something that is really different in the US and Europe. But it's good also. I mean, I prefer transparency and to know exactly what is on my dish or what I'm eating or what I'm eating, etc. Than discovering that later because it was in the small character in an IFU. But yeah, it's something that's, I think it's good. There is good and bad, but for sure. So if we can say that it's the law that we have to follow. So promotional compliance is the law that we have to follow to promote our products in a fair way, to be sure that the message is well understood and that we are not kind of misleading the people or misleading the patients regarding the usage of the product. So this is mainly the scope of this thing. So for that, we have if I can say, the ads, as you mentioned. We have some brochures. We have a lot of documents that are existing where we can mention all about those benefits or adverse events, etc. So we have all those documents. So can you talk to us about the difference between each of them?
Sure. So first of all, before we get into that a little bit further, what I'd like to talk about is a common misconception.
Okay.
So people, when the average person thinks about medical devices, they're thinking of like pacemakers. They're thinking of stents. And they're talking about how each of these, and those are true medical devices for sure. But what people forget are, theoretically speaking, your Fitbit is also a medical device. Theoretically speaking, if your Apple iWatch is tracking your heart rate, it's a medical device. If you are, if you land up in a scenario where you're using some kind of software to track how you feel, it could be a medical device. So you have to remember that software can be a medical device, even if that wasn't your thought process. So that's the first piece. So the claims and the types of commitments you make and the thought processes you have all apply. So that's the first thing. Then what I like to think about as the difference between labeling, and advertising. So when the FDA comes in and you negotiate the label that goes along with it. So when you have what's called a PMA, a pre-market approval, you might negotiate the actual label that goes along with your device.
So that there is some back and forth. It means that you make a proposal, FDA come with a counter proposal, you go with another, because it's a negotiation really that you want to defend your kind of wording, and they want to defend patients. So it's why there is these back and forth things.
Correct. And it's not that they're giving up or anything like that. It's what does the science support? So you might say the science supports will help all patients, and the FDA might come back with, no. You only did the study in these 4 types of patients. So it's only these types of claims you can make. So but you go, those 4 types of people represented everyone. So it's a fair representation. So that's the conversation that you'll have during a labeling discussion. But that's the label that goes along with it. The US Supreme Court came out and basically said, okay, that's a label. No one's really arguing over if that's a label. Here's the next question. What if every time I took a medical device, and let's say I have a medical device that's indicated as approved for treating heart murmurs, right? Treating some kind of heart murmur. And I find that if I take that same medical device and put it on my back, it helps my back feel better. But obviously it's not been approved for that new indication. So I can't promote it, but what if someone else has written about it? Can I give that book every single time my device gets sold? I give a book, and the book happens to talk about the back pain thing. Is that considered to be advertising? Is that considered to be a label? Well, it's not the label because it's not on the bottle or it's not on the package. So the U.S. Supreme Court came out and said, if it accompanies the product, we will consider that labeling.
Okay.
So you got the label, which is on the product, and the labeling, which accompanies the product. And then you've got your, go ahead.
It's off, if I remember right, it's off labeling, if I can say. It's we call that off labeling. So it's some surgeon can, for example, use a device in another way than what is prescribed, and it's off labeling. We cannot promote it, but if the surgeon writes on this off labeling usage and says it's a good thing and it's working well, etc., the firm can use it to sell with this indication.
Very not quite. So off-label is a slightly different beast altogether.
Okay.
So let's get to off-label in a second, because it's a great conversation.
No problem.
And there's a lot of stuff that's going on in off-label stuff. So we'll talk about that in a second. So you've got your label, which is on the product. You've got your labeling that goes along with the product. And then you've got your advertising, which is, like you said, the banners and the advertisements and the, brochure that goes along with it. So that's the three differences. Then you raise the concept of what is off-label then. And as you pointed out, in the case of off-label, you've got a situation where a doctor, so I have 20 years of practice as a pharmacist. I've worked in hospitals all the time. You ask me today what the approved uses for any antibiotic are, I couldn't tell you. I have no idea, because I know what that antibiotic works for, and I'd use it as long as it works for that specific indication. I don't really know what was actually approved for. In the same way, medical devices, as long as it works for that, I, as a clinician, will use it for that indication. And there's nothing that should stop me from doing it that way. So in the US, it is perfectly legal for a clinician to use the product as they deem fit. However, the pharmaceutical company or the medical device company cannot do that. They cannot promote the product for that off-label use. So, go ahead. So
they cannot promote it officially, or they can still discuss about it with clinicians?
So there's again, that would be promotion at that point, right?
Okay.
So theoretically speaking, so we're doing like a master class on this, so I can talk about it for sure, but I don't want to confuse so many concepts here. So theoretically speaking, there is an exception, which is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment basically comes out and says that if it's one scientist talking to another scientist for the purpose of scientific discussion, then theoretically speaking, the FDA does not have jurisdiction. And theoretically speaking, it has, as long as it's scientific discussion, go ahead, talk about anything you think is appropriate. The problem is, what if you have a scenario where so let's say I'm a pharmacist, I have a doctorate in pharmacy, I can have that scientific discussion, but I'm being paid based on how much I sell.
Okay.
At that point, if I'm having a conversation with another scientist, it's unfair to argue that I'm having a discussion as a scientist to scientist conversation. So if it's not a scientist to scientist conversation, it's at that point promotional. Do you see the distinction?
I see the distinction. It's, I think, a fair point to add to this because, yeah, at one point, if you are hiring somebody to promote your material, even if it's a scientist, it's exactly promotion. It's not discussion anymore. So, yeah.
Exactly right. So at that point, that's not off. That would be off-label marketing. And off-label marketing is, this is gonna get tough because there's a lot of stuff going on there. It is generally regarded as inappropriate. The reason, if you would have asked me this 5 years ago, I'd have told you it is illegal.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the FDA has lost 6 court cases on off-label promotion. And the FDA literally put out I think it was a 60-page memo with a 21-page argument going, here are 21 options. We don't know how to regulate off-label speech yet. What do you guys think? Which direction do you think we should be going? And the FDA doesn't know the answer yet. We know, for example, in the case of drugs, there's a company called Amarin, where the FDA has specifically allowed the company to promote off-label. But that it's the only company in the world which has this exception, shall we say.
Okay.
But we expect the future to look different. But at this moment, I don't know any company that is stepping into off-label promotion outside Amarin. Not because it couldn't be defended, but because it's a very complicated area which we don't have rules for yet. So one of the things you mentioned a little bit ago, you were talking about this idea of fair.
Yeah.
And the key piece, the courts have come out and basically said, you can promote things as long as it's truthful and not misleading. The problem is, what do those words mean? And we don't know the meaning of those words yet. So if you do that wrong, you could be looking at multi-billion-dollar fines.
Okay.
Be looking at jail sentences. And here's a really good example at Theranos. The claims they were making were not truthful or would be false and were misleading. That would be problematic. Now, in that case, they weren't actually selling to people, but they were selling to investors, and that would be problematic as well. But that's a slightly different discussion. But yeah.
Yeah, I heard about this story about Theranos, and it's something that maybe, as you mentioned in all the discussion, but it's exactly that. So promoting something that doesn't exist or doesn't work or doesn't think so, it's really not good. So now, as we really have a good understanding of the concept, if I can say, of promotional compliance and of what is in, what is out, etc. So if people are now trying to go to the US market, and they want to put it to register some products and to start, if I can say, promoting their products in the US. What are some basic rules or some basic things that they have to go through, or maybe a step-by-step thing that they have to go through to be sure that they are not in the illegal part?
So the key pieces you start remembering is, again, we're going to assume that you're going to stick with the rules that most companies are using right now, which is you're going to stick with on-label promotion. So the first thing is, you want to make sure you know what the label says. You want to make sure that you're compliant with the label. Now, there are guidances on being consistent with the label and issues that go along with that, which is a fair discussion. We can have that discussion. But at a 50,000 foot view, at a 100,000 foot view level, you want to start thinking about, am I consistent with my label? Am I compliant with my label? The second question you want to start asking about is, does the FDA have opinions on how these types of claims should be made? Are there limits to what you can say? For example, if you're doing a PMA versus a 510K, in the PMA, you get to negotiate what your label might look like. But for a 510K, you have to adhere to whatever the label previously was, because you're saying, I am just like that product. So you can't be, I'm just like that product, but let me differentiate myself.
So we are choosing for 510K, we are choosing a predicate, so a product that is already on the market. And then we have to compare ourselves to this product. So I suppose we cannot claim more features or more things than this product. So it's really a limitation. So it's a problem.
Correct. And then you got to start thinking about things like, am I a restricted device or a non-restricted device? Am I class 1 or class 2? Like how? Because depending on what you're doing, you might have FDA jurisdiction or you might have FTC jurisdiction. FTC jurisdiction is a lot easier for marketing compliance. FDA, for example, if you have the Jarvis heart, so it's an artificial heart, they have more controls for that. While if you're talking about a toothbrush, which is technically also a medical device, they have less controls that the FTC regulates what a toothbrush can say about its bristles. So that's another thing. You also want to be thinking about what your contracts allow for. So you might have a license that may prevent you from saying things. You want to think about what your sales reps are talking about. You want to start thinking about if you're going to be reimbursed for it, what are the implications? So there's what's called the False Claims Act or the anti-kickback law, all of which would come into play. So because it's so complicated, what a lot of these companies land up doing is they land up using what's called an MLR board or PRC board. Okay. So an MLR board stands for Medical, Legal, Regulatory. And what that board is, it's an independent board. Sometimes it's not inside the company. Sometimes it's not. The company may or may not want to take that on. And what these people will do is review potential advertisements or potential promotional pieces. And so the idea
it's like a regulatory affairs group that we have for registration of product, but they are specific for promotional material, and they have to review that. They have maybe a checklist or something saying we should not say this, we should not say that, or we should be more this or that.
So unfortunately, it's really hard to do a checklist because my experience is that with advertisers, you give them a checklist, they'll make sure to stick with the checklist, but there'll always be things that you haven't thought of. You're like, no. I know it's not on the checklist, but it's still not okay.
Okay, so it's really a case-by-case study, and you have really to, it's common sense, if I can say. You have really to have common sense and to really review one by one.
It tends to be a case-by-case basis. It also, you talked about it being a regulatory affairs group. Regulatory is only one component.
Mm-hmm.
We'll also have legal. We'll also have clinical. We may have statisticians. You may have payer experts, all of which would come into play depending on the types of claims that are being made. So that's the other piece to consider. So you probably don't want to do this alone without having the appropriate oversight. And obviously, to be fair, I do offer that service. So I do that for medical device companies.
It's I think it's an important piece to have for people that don't understand, if I can say that have some difficulties to understand if this is right what you are doing or wrong. So having, as you mentioned, all the components of your company with all their expertise to come at the table and discuss really a case and say yes or no and approve it is also, I think, the best strategy. I think we have that also sometime for vigilance when we have a vigilance. In the market, we have escalations, we have all this, and we have all the different groups that are coming and say, should we report to FDA or not? Should we, what exactly is the action we have to do, the field safety corrective action? So it's exactly the same process, but really for promotional material.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like any other group, right? So some people compare it to an IRB. So some people say it's sort of like an IRB that meets on a consistent basis and reviews and comments. Yeah, similar to that. It's with a specific focus, that's all.
So now we have all this. Let's talk about a bit of penalties. So if you are not respecting the rules, what's happening to you?
So there's an escalation. There are various escalations that can take place. You've got situations where you could have companies simply receive an untitled letter from the FDA saying, this is not compliant. You need to fix this. It might be a title letter, like a warning letter or the like, saying, we told you this is a major serious problem. You need to fix this. You might be in a scenario where you get what's called an injunction. So the courts come in and stop you from promoting. You might be in a scenario where individuals start getting targeted. So there's something called the Park Doctrine. And the Park Doctrine is specific under the U.S. Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act. And that basically says whether or not you as the CEO knew what types of promotions were actually happening, we are going to hold you responsible for it. So it's what's called a strict liability doctrine, which is extremely difficult because you are not actually aware of the problems, but you are responsible for those problems.
Okay.
Then there's a situation, for example, where you might have the company being responsible and companies being shut down over this. You might be in a scenario where the CEO, for example, you might have a scenario where the CEO says something. So the company and the CEO is responsible. The CEO might get disbarred. So there are exclusionary rules that can apply. So the CEO may not be able to participate in any company that does any business with what's called health and human services. So you can't work not only for a medical device company, but also not for a pharma company, not even as a janitor in a pharmacy, because the pharmacy is still submitting claims to the health and human services.
Okay, so it's really a big. I mean, it can escalate quickly, but are we reaching this level so often, or it's really as soon as we have the first letter, if I can say, we say, okay, let's calm down and let's stop what we are doing now?
So most companies don't reach the level where you're targeting at the criminal and administrative levels. Most companies will take a step back and try to reassess. I have seen scenarios where ad agencies will come out and say, you know what, getting a warning letter from the FDA is a badge of honor. It means I did my job right. I'm not sure that's smart.
I mean, on my companies, we had 2 warning letters and it was really a nightmare. So it's not, I don't think it's really a badge of honor.
Right. But again, if you think about what they're coming at it from a very creative viewpoint. And they're saying we really pushed the envelope. And maybe we pushed it just a little harder than we should have, but it means that we really did a good job in pushing the envelope. Maybe, but probably not in the right direction. That was not the message that was intended for you. So those are the types of discussions. Now, there are individuals, for example, the Synthes case, where there was... there's so many situations we can get into. I don't remember the exact details of the Synthes case, but essentially the result of that was because of inappropriate promotion, people ended up dying. And because they actually asked someone to do, I think it was surgeries, without appropriate controls in place. And people ended up dying, and the company had to be sold, and individuals were actually prosecuted. So that's a whole discussion that I have to be careful of, because the last time I did this talk, there were people who were intimately familiar in my class.
Okay.
And they're like, we can't talk about it. You have most of the right information that was publicly available. Here's some more information that we discovered, and we were part of that whole beast. So I have to be careful. But those are the kinds of issues you need to be thinking about. Is it every guy who gets prosecuted? No.
Let's try maybe to then not reach this level. Let's try
that's a good goal.
to stay on the legal side of the law for the US region.
Yep.
So is there any other tips, if I can say, that people have to follow, or it's really that just follow the rules, and as soon as you have the first signal from FDA, so just step back, if I can say, or think again about what you are doing to avoid to reach all those things? Or is there something else?
No, I think you have the general idea right, which is you have to stick to the rules, and the rules sometimes feel contradictory. Sometimes they feel like they don't work together. They do. You just have to think about them a little bit further. Reach out to me, and I know you're going to get some information about how to reach me in the show notes.
Yeah.
You can also call me directly in the US at 215-948-8183. That's 215-948-8183. Or you can go to my website at kulkarnilawfirm.com, and I'd be happy to talk to you further.
Yeah, I will put all those details, if I can say, on the show notes, that people can reach out to you, because I think the most important is to get the right experts to help you on your solving your problem. So having you here, I think, is a good thing, because you seem to be really knowing what you are doing. So it's great for our audience. And also one thing that I wanted to talk quickly is about, you are also starting a podcast. So I'm really looking at all people that are starting a podcast in the medical device field. And I find yours, and you are starting really to talk about also the same thing. So to give your point of view about regulations, specifically for the US. And I wanted you to talk a bit more about that. So maybe if people are interested, they can also connect with you.
Absolutely. And again, you'll provide the link for that as well. But essentially what it is I advise companies that have anything to do with FDA regulations. And that can be a combination of food, it could be drugs, it could be devices, it could be tobacco, it could be cannabis. I get pulled into all cosmetics, get pulled into all of these at different points depending on what kind of help they need. Anything preclinical, it can be also in the clinical research area. I've gotten pulled in, and lastly into just promotional, and then actually have even done and have experience with generics. And how does that process get handled, and evergreening, and dealing with that situation as well. So my podcast deals with each of these issues, and it deals with what is the current news and what is my take on that in light of current industry trends. So sometimes it might be, well, what is the impact on patients? It might be, what will the regulators do in this situation? What is the most likely scenario? Sometimes it might be, what is the impact on a medical device company that is trying to solve this and this new regulations come out? Who's impacted and who's not impacted and still has an opinion, or someone who's impacted is not being considered? So all of those would be thoughts I have.
So it's great. And so what are the last topic you were discussing on your podcast, for example?
So a few topics I've recently pulled up. One was, how do you keep subjects enrolled in your clinical study? One was on the recent CBD hearing, so on cannabis. Another recent podcast was on vaping. Okay. And what is the impact of vaping? And I don't know if you guys know this, but vaping is when you have these new nicotine products which you put in your mouth and smoke. But what is the impact? How is the FDA dealing with it? And there are a slew of others that are coming out. So I can't remember which ones are released and which ones aren't yet. But those give the flavoring.
No, it's great. So if people are really interested by all those topics, I think the podcast of Darshan is really the place to go and to listen. As Darshan said, I will put everything on the show notes. And Darshan, I think mainly as everyone, we can find you on LinkedIn. So it's also a place where I will mention you. And I will also put your website so people can go directly to that. Okay, Darshan. So is there anything else from your side?
I think that covers all of it. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
And as you said, so if I have other topics about the US, I know I will call you for another podcast.
For sure. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Darshan. And have a good day.
You too. Take care.
Take care.